He was born wrong, white fur, pink eyes, too small, too slow. From the moment he took his first breath, the pride turned away. Even his mother rejected him. No one expected him to survive the day. Until one low-ranking lioness did something unthinkable. She turned back. What followed was nothing short of a transformation. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a story of how an entire wild society learned to adapt and to accept what they once feared. The night over the Kgalagadi came down heavy and breathless, as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Heat still clung to the red sand long after the sun had vanished, and the wind carried the dry, metallic scent of dust and thorn. Beneath a low rise of cracked earth and scrub grass, a lioness labored in silence. Makari had given birth before. She knew the rhythm of pain, the instinctive pull between mother and cub, the familiar scent of new life. 3 cubs slid into the world first, warm, golden, strong. She cleaned them quickly, efficiently, her tongue rough but reassuring, her body already curving around them in practiced protection. Then came the 4th. For a moment, Makari froze. This cub did not carry the desert's colors. Its fur was pale, unnaturally so, almost white, as if the moon itself had stained it. In the dim starlight, the cub looked unfinished, fragile, wrong. Its eyes were sealed shut, its movements weak and uncoordinated, its tiny body trembling against the cooling air. Makari sniffed it once, then again. She did not lie down beside it. In the unforgiving economy of the wild, instinct ruled more harshly than emotion. A pride already stretched thin by drought could not afford weakness. Waterholes were shrinking. Prey had grown scarce. Every mouth mattered. Every step slowed by the weakest member could cost the entire group its survival. Makari turned back to the 3 golden cubs and pulled them close. The pale cub let out a thin, rasping sound, not a roar, barely even a cry, but the sound faded into the night, swallowed by the wind. By dawn, the pride had already begun to move. The dominant male lifted his head once, catching the scent of blood and birth, then dismissed it with a low rumble. Around him, the lionesses rose and followed, muscles rippling beneath dust-streaked coats. No one looked back. The white cub lay where it had been born. The sun climbed quickly, merciless and direct. Light spilled over the Kgalagadi like fire, bleaching the land and turning every shadow into a refuge. The cub tried to crawl, its small paws scraping uselessly against the sand. Its skin, lacking the natural protection of pigment, reacted almost immediately. Heat pressed down on its body, and it gasped shallowly, chest fluttering like a trapped bird. In a world built on strength, it was not supposed to survive. From a rocky ridge nearly half a mile away, a pair of binoculars tracked the slow movement of the pride. Elias Storm lowered them only when the sun burned his eyes. He had been watching lions for most of his adult life, documenting their behavior for wildlife conservation studies, advising environmental protection groups, and contributing data to long-term research grants tied to national park preservation. He knew what abandonment looked like. At first, Elias thought he was mistaken. Albinism in lions was extraordinarily rare, often confused with leucism, and almost never documented in free-ranging. Prides. He adjusted his focus, heart tightening as the image sharpened. A cub, alone. Elias exhaled slowly. Experience had taught him that reacting too quickly often did more harm than good. The rules he lived by were simple, reinforced by decades in the field and by mistakes that had once cost him his career. Observe, record, do not interfere. Nature balanced itself in ways humans barely understood. Still, he could not look away. The cub did not stop moving. That alone surprised him. Weak as it was, it kept dragging itself forward, inch by inch, following a scent trail already fading beneath the rising heat. Its persistence bordered on tragic determination, as if it believed, without question, that someone would eventually turn back. By midday, vultures had begun to circle, wide and patient. Elias felt the familiar pressure build in his chest, the old argument resurfacing. Intervention saved lives, but it also rewrote outcomes. Wildlife insurance policies, relocation programs, and protected breeding initiatives existed for cases like this, funded by well-meaning donors and institutions. Yet he had seen how easily such interventions shattered natural social structures. A single rescued animal could unravel an entire pride. He wrote in his field notebook anyway, careful and precise, documenting the cub's condition, the pride's trajectory, the environmental stressors. His notes would be valuable later, for science, for conservation, for people who studied lions from offices thousands of miles away. But none of that eased the weight of watching a living creature fade under an open sky. As the sun began its slow descent, the air cooled just enough to offer a brief reprieve. The cub had stopped moving. Its sides rose and fell erratically. Dust clung to its pale fur, turning it the color of ash. That was when another shape emerged from the distance. She moved cautiously, low to the ground, ears flicking at every sound. Zara was younger than most of the lionesses, leaner, often pushed to the edge during hunts. She had never birthed cubs of her own. In the hierarchy of the pride, she barely registered. She paused when she saw the cub. Zara approached slowly, circling once, then lowering her head to sniff. The cub stirred, releasing another thin sound. Something in Zara's posture changed, not urgency, not fear, but recognition. She lay down beside it. Zara positioned her body carefully, blocking the last of the sun, creating a pocket of shade with her ribs and flank. The cub shifted instinctively, pressing against the warmth. Zara did not pull away. From the ridge, Elias held his breath. This was not part of the pattern. This was not what data predicted. As dusk settled over the Kgalagadi, the cub's breathing steadied, just slightly. The desert cooled, and for the first time since its birth, the white cub was not alone. Night fell quietly, carrying with it the unspoken question that hovered between instinct and hope. The Tapmarti cub was still alive, and somewhere in the dark, something had begun to change. The sun was just beginning to spill over the rust-colored dunes of Kgalagadi when Elias Storm raised his binoculars to his eyes. From his vantage point atop a rocky ridge, the land unfolded like a parchment, cracked, vast, and humming with silence. A gentle wind carried the scent of acacia sap and old dust, and beneath the breeze, the distant call of a martial eagle echoed. Elias didn't move. He hadn't moved much in days. At 62, Elias was no longer the man who once chased elephants across Tanzania or wrangled government permits in the thick of Congo's rainforests. He had stepped away, voluntarily, though not without grief, after a decision to relocate an injured cheetah cub had led to the death of its entire coalition. Conservation was like medicine, he had come to believe. Sometimes doing nothing was the only way to do no harm. That belief had brought him here, alone, to this semi-permanent hide nestled into the rocks above the lion pride's known territory. He'd been observing the Kgalagadi pride for nearly 5 weeks, scribbling notes in his leather-bound journal, eating tinned beans, drinking lukewarm instant coffee, and waiting. For what, he hadn't known. Until now. He adjusted the focus of his binoculars. There it was again, the small, pale figure curled in the sand beside the dry roots of a camelthorn tree. The albino lion cub, smaller than the rest. The wrong color, the wrong size, the wrong everything. It didn't move, not even a twitch, just a faint rise and fall of its tiny chest, like a struggling tide trying to hold on to the shore. Elias leaned back slightly and exhaled through his nose. It was alive, but barely. He'd watched yesterday's rejection unfold in painful detail. The mother, Makari, had nudged away the white cub while favoring her 3 tawny-colored offspring. The pride had gone on to lie in the shade, grooming, dozing, occasionally playing with the other cubs. The white one was left alone in the sun. In the margin of his notebook, Elias had written, 1 out of 4, rejected, genetic anomaly, high mortality probability, no intervention. But now that clinical distance was starting to crumble. The cub had not moved in hours. Its tiny ribs were visible even from this distance. Elias lowered the binoculars and reached for his long lens camera instead. He framed the scene in his viewfinder. Click, click. Each image was a documentation, yes, but also a silent question. How long can something so small survive so much indifference? He zoomed out and swept the camera across the pride. The others were fine. Fat-bellied cubs climbing on their aunts, adolescent males gnawing at sun-bleached bones, the old matriarch dozing with flies buzzing around her scarred nose. The social structure was stable, efficient, ruthless. It was survival economics at its purest, but it also left no room for weakness. Still, something about this cub's presence bothered Elias deeply, perhaps because it mirrored too much of what he had come to regret. The act of standing still, watching suffering from behind glass and lenses. He poured a lukewarm cup of water from a battered thermos and drank. The heat was already climbing, and soon the sand would be hot enough to blister. He looked again. The cub had shifted, only a little, but enough to show it wasn't dead. Yet. He picked up his voice recorder and clicked it on. Day 38, he began quietly. White cub remains unacknowledged by the pride. Signs of dehydration, lethargy. No suckling observed in 24 hours. Behavioral data suggests social rejection is now total. Makari avoids eye contact. The matriarch does not interfere. Pride continues normal routines. He paused, recorder still running. I should note, he added, voice softening, that it is the first time I have ever witnessed an albino lion in the wild, and the first time I have wished I hadn't. He clicked the recorder off. There had been whispers in the conservation world for years about the moral gray zones of wildlife observation. A new wave of field researchers was advocating for ethical intervention when non-disruptive methods were available. Drones supplied hydration, remote veterinary support, discreet reintroductions. Elias had once lectured against that trend, arguing for what he called ecological humility. But here, now alone with a starving cub and nothing but his field notes, humility felt a lot like cowardice. He stood, knees popping, and walked to the back of the ridge where his solar-powered satellite transceiver sat beside a rolled-up tarp. He could send a message to the park rangers. He knew them. They would respond quickly, discreetly, with trained hands and minimal disturbance. They might even save it. He crouched beside the transceiver and stared at the keypad. And then he heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the hum of cicadas and the rustle of dry grass. Not a roar, not a cry, but something softer. A murmur. A purr. He rushed back to the binoculars. The cub was no longer alone. A young lioness, Zara, he thought, was standing beside it. She was licking the cub's ears, slow and deliberate, like a mother who had made a quiet decision. Elias's heart beat faster. She wasn't Makari. She had no cubs of her own. But she had returned, and now she was lying down, curling her body around the tiny pale frame. Elias stared, disbelieving. Zara was not one of the dominant females. She was often pushed away from kills, left behind on hunts. She bore no scars, no cubs, no titles. In many ways, she was invisible. But now the invisible lioness had done something extraordinary. She had made a choice the pride had refused to make. Elias slowly reached for his camera. The lens trembled slightly in his hands. He adjusted the aperture. ISO 640. Focal length 500 millimeters. Click. The image appeared. A pale cub pressed against the warmth of an outsider who had chosen compassion over instinct. In the background, the rest of the pride slumbered, unaware. Elias whispered, as if speaking might break the spell, "Don't let them see you." He knew the risk Zara had just taken. If the matriarch or the dominant male interpreted her behavior as weakness or rebellion, she could be injured, even killed. Lions did not reward sentimentality. But perhaps there was something deeper at work, something no field guide or GPS collar could measure. He scribbled a new line in his notebook. Observed act of surrogate caregiving, behavioral anomaly, possibly first step toward social reintegration. Will monitor, no interference. He circled no interference twice. Then he sat back, camera still in hand, and let the desert light fall across his notebook, his lens, and the impossible scene below. There were stories happening in this place, stories that did not need narration, only attention. And far below the ridge, beneath the shade of a low bush, a lioness lay curled around a cub that wasn't supposed to survive. By the second morning, the white cub had become a ghost among its own kind. The sun rose faster in the Kgalagadi than in most places Elias had worked. One moment the sky was dusted in lavender, the next it blazed with that familiar furnace glow. Shadows shrank, and the heat came in waves, rippling off the sand like mirages. But even in the thick of that rising heat, Elias barely blinked. His binoculars were locked on the edge of the brush where he had seen them last. Zara and the albino cub. The pride had moved at dawn, following a herd of springbok that had passed in the distance. The movement was methodical, mothers urging cubs along, males scanning the horizon, the matriarch moving with the confidence of routine. All except one. Zara had hung back. Her hesitation hadn't been dramatic. No growls, no defiance, just a quiet refusal to walk away from what others had abandoned. And there he was now, the cub nestled under her chest, his pale coat streaked with dust, his breathing shallow but steadier than yesterday. From his ridge, Elias could see the faint rhythm of life pulsing beneath the fur, and it was more than he had dared to hope. Zara licked the cub's face with slow, circular motions, her eyes darting nervously toward the thicket where the others had disappeared. She was supposed to follow. The hunt was crucial. The pride had failed twice in the last week. Hunger was beginning to show in their eyes and their movements. Every adult lion was needed. But Zara was staying behind, risking her position for a cub that had no standing. Elias felt his throat tighten. He had seen mothers reject cubs, prides abandon the sick, even lions kill their own to preserve balance. But this was different. There was no evolutionary benefit here, no guarantee of survival, no obvious reward. This was sacrifice. This was choice. The drone of flies filled the air. Zara twitched her ears and adjusted her position to better shade the cub from the sun. Her ribs were visible now, too. The act of protecting had begun to cost her. As the heat reached its zenith, Elias quietly unpacked a small solar fan and positioned it inside his observation tent. The tech was silent, efficient, designed for wildlife photography and field biologists working long hours in hostile terrain. He poured a half cup of filtered water into a tin cup and sipped it slowly, still watching. The hours crawled by. Zara only moved to adjust her body or scan the horizon. She had become a statue of maternal defiance, carved into the dust. The cub nuzzled her leg occasionally, but otherwise lay still. It didn't cry. It didn't call out. Perhaps instinct had taught it already. Noise brought danger, and attention meant death. Mid-afternoon brought the sound of movement. A young male lion, one of the subadult brothers from Makari's earlier litter, emerged from the thorny scrub. His body was lean, not yet full-grown, but his gaze was sharp. Elias tensed. Zara saw him too. She rose halfway, her body curving over the cub like a shield. The young male stopped a few yards away, his golden eyes fixed on the pale thing at her feet. He snarled, not with full hostility, but with that unmistakable blend of confusion and threat. As if to say, "What is that, and why are you with it?" Zara stood her ground. She didn't growl, she didn't challenge, but she didn't move either. For several long seconds, the two lions stared at each other. Then, without a sound, the male turned and trotted off. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That night, as the temperature dropped and the stars unfurled across the desert sky, Elias huddled beneath his tarp and reviewed the footage. He paused on a frame where Zara stood over the cub, the male watching, the brush behind them lit with golden sunset. He scribbled in his notebook, "Zara shows consistent maternal behavior despite lack of kinship. Risk of discovery increasing. Social dynamics unstable. Possible division forming." He turned off the lantern and lay in the dark, his mind buzzing. The next morning, things changed. Just before dawn, while the sky was still blue-black and the ground was coated in frost, Zara rose and nudged the cub gently with her nose. Then she began to drag him, slowly, carefully, toward the scent trail of the pride. She wasn't leaving him behind. Elias watched as she carried the cub by the scruff, stopping every few dozen steps to rest. Her movements were uneven. The burden wasn't physical. This cub weighed nothing, but the psychological weight of defiance, of risk, of exposure, made her steps heavy. By sunrise, she had reached the outskirts of the pride's resting place. It was a shallow gully flanked by dry grass and elephant bones. The pride lay sprawled across the sand, Makari and her 3 cubs curled together, the dominant male at the center and the matriarch half asleep under a leadwood tree. Zara placed the albino cub down at the edge of the clearing. Then she lay beside him, not pushing him forward, not trying to hide him, just waiting. Elias lifted his camera again. The scene unfolding below felt impossibly fragile. Several of the lionesses lifted their heads. One cub bounded toward Zara, but stopped abruptly, startled by the white cub's appearance. A low growl rumbled from the dominant male's chest. Makari rose to her feet, eyes narrowing. She took a few slow steps forward. Zara remained still. Makari came closer. Her breath could be seen in the cold morning air. She sniffed the white cub who did not move. Then she turned her gaze on Zara, not with fury, not with pity, but with something more ambiguous. Calculation, perhaps. And then, without a sound, Makari walked away. The matriarch never moved. The male lay back down. Zara had not been welcomed, but she hadn't been cast out either. For Elias, it was the most extraordinary moment of the entire study. Not an act of acceptance, not yet, but a silence, a space, a possibility. He tapped his recorder. Day 39. Zara has reintroduced the cub to the periphery of the pride. No aggression shown, no assistance given. Pride appears in observational mode. Social tension remains. However, he stopped. However, he said aloud, staring through the lens, this might be how change begins. The keyword phrase, wildlife conservation ethics, passed briefly through his mind. It was something he had spoken about at conferences, written about in peer-reviewed articles, and watched become buzzwords in grant applications and non-profit marketing campaigns. But here, in this dust and wind, the words felt heavier. Real. This wasn't theory. It was blood, fur, and breath. It was a lioness who had nothing choosing to protect something with even less. And just maybe, it was the first breath of a miracle. The Kgalagadi wind was different that morning. It carried a dry charge, sharp and unpredictable, like static clinging to dry grass. Even from his ridge, Elias could feel it, a weight in the air that didn't belong. The animals felt it too. The ground squirrels vanished early. A group of guinea fowl darted across the open plain with none of their usual chaos, running silent and low to the ground. Overhead, the sky pressed down with a thick, dull weight, cloudless but threatening. Zara stirred before the others. She had become a light sleeper since taking on the white cub, always half aware, even in rest. The cub, now with a bit more strength in his limbs, pressed his nose into her side and blinked against the dust. He didn't play like the other cubs. His eyes, pink-rimmed and sensitive, watered easily in the daylight. His movements were cautious. But he was alive. The pride had not embraced him. But they no longer chased him off either. Elias had noted it carefully in his log. Passive tolerance has emerged. No interaction. No aggression. He wrote the words clinically, but his heart knew what it meant. Zara had bought the cub a place in the world. A precarious, unwelcome, temporary place, but a place nonetheless. And then the wind shifted. It was mid-morning when the sky changed. The color stayed the same, brutal blue, but the light took on a strange, golden haze. Elias looked up from his camera and sniffed. Smoke, faint but growing. He stood and scanned the horizon. To the northwest, maybe 5 or 6 miles, a dark smudge had begun to smear the sky. His stomach clenched. Lightning storms had passed through the area the night before. In these dry months it didn't take much. A single strike, a single spark, and the land could burn for days. He grabbed his field radio. No signal. The satellite relay was set to low power during daylight to conserve battery. That had been fine, until now. Back down in the gully, the pride hadn't reacted yet. The fire was too far to smell directly, and the breeze carried it sideways. But Elias had spent enough years in this region to know fires didn't ask for permission. If the wind turned southeast, the blaze could be on them in hours. He refocused on Zara. She was grooming the cub, who now sat upright between her paws. For the first time since he'd been born, the little lion lifted his chin toward the light, not high, but enough to reveal a tiny scar under his left eye. A scratch from a dry thorn bush, probably. Elias zoomed in and froze the frame. The image was beautiful, quiet, defiant, fragile. And then everything changed. It happened in under 10 minutes. A sudden gust swept through the valley, and with it came the smell, thick, acrid, unmistakable. Smoke rolled over the dunes like a crawling wall, and birds erupted from the trees in frantic waves. The pride jolted upright, ears flattened, eyes wide. Elias grabbed his scope and swept the horizon. The fire had leapt. The Paib wind had shifted. Fast, flames tore across the lower plain like liquid light, feeding on brittle brush and desiccated roots. The sound was a roar, low and steady, like an approaching train. Panic gripped the pride. Mothers grabbed their cubs in their mouths. The dominant male bellowed and bounded up the slope, leading the retreat. Dust and smoke filled the air, but one lion stayed behind. Zara. Elias's heart stopped. She had turned back. In the chaos, the white cub had fallen behind, too slow to follow, his legs too short and uncertain. Zara had dropped her instinct to run. She spun around, her body cutting through the haze, and bounded back toward the cub. He could barely see them now, just flashes of movement between smoke and sand. The cub was trying to move, staggering, falling, his head low. And then a new sound broke through the rush of fire. Hyenas! Elias couldn't believe it. A pack of opportunistic scavengers had crept in from the east, drawn by the confusion. Hyenas knew the fire would displace prey. They weren't picky. Weakness was an invitation. Zara saw them too. She placed herself between the cub and the incoming threat, her body low, tail lashing, her teeth bared in a silent snarl. She was one lioness, exhausted, half-starved, and alone. The hyenas advanced, 6 of them, maybe 7, their heads low and laughing. Elias acted. He didn't think. He moved. From the far corner of his observation tent, he yanked open a protective case and pulled out a compact drone. It wasn't military grade. It wasn't even designed for emergencies. It was used for topographic mapping and occasional surveillance. But it had speakers. He powered it on, connected to the control pad, and launched it into the air. The whir of the propellers disappeared in the roar of the wind. He toggled the speaker and pressed play. A tiger's roar. Artificial, yes, pre-recorded from a conservation center in India, but loud, deep, alien. The sound burst across the plain, amplified by the drone's height, echoing off the cliffs. The hyenas froze. For one miraculous second, they hesitated, ears swiveling, bodies crouching. Zara lunged. With a roar of her own, she charged them, not to kill, not to win, but to scatter. And scatter they did, retreating in sudden confusion, running not from her, but from the unnatural sound booming from the sky. Zara didn't wait. She grabbed the cub by the scruff and turned. The fire was closer now. Too close. Elias used the drone again, flying it low over the brush in their path, blowing away dust and fanning smoke in the opposite direction. It was dangerous, stupid, illegal, even under some park codes. But it worked. It bought her minutes. And in this kind of fire, minutes were gold. Zara emerged from the haze like a phantom, her coat streaked with ash, the cub dangling from her jaw. She ran, limping, panting, until she reached the ridge beyond the gully, high ground. There, she collapsed. Elias watched through his lens, breath caught. The pride had not returned. The others had moved on. But the wind was shifting again, and the fire had begun to die in places where the earth was already blackened. He lowered his drone. He did not log this in his field notes. That night, after the wind died and the stars returned, Elias sat in silence. The desert had been remade. Charred patches spread across the plain like bruises. A few antelope had not made it. A troop of baboons had vanished. But Zara and the cub were alive. He wrote only one sentence that day. This was not interference, and under it, in smaller print, this was faith applied with tools. As the night wore on, he reviewed the drone footage. The audio spike of the tiger roar, the hyenas scattering, the final sprint through smoke. In the last frame, just before the battery died, the white cub looked up at Zara. His ash-covered face turned toward her side, his nose pressed to her ribcage. Elias closed the laptop slowly. There would be consequences. If the pride found out. If the rangers investigated. If someone traced the sound. But he didn't regret it. Because some stories aren't about survival of the fittest. They're about the survival of the willing. The fire had passed, but the ash remained. Days in the Kgalagadi didn't end. They simply shifted. From the blinding white heat of noon to the flat orange hush of dusk, and then into the brittle, breathless cold of desert night. In that silence, scorched ground whispered beneath paw and claw. Trees were left skeletal. Smoke clung to everything. The pride had moved again, farther east toward a shallow ravine where acacia trees still held green leaves. They were slower now, more cautious. Their world had changed. But even more than the fire, it was Zara who had left a mark none of them could ignore. She returned to the group limping, not from injury, but from fatigue deeper than muscle. Ash clung to her side like paint. The white cub followed close behind, still shaky, but upright. His fur was darker now, dirtied by soot and survival. And the others watched. Makari didn't approach, nor did the matriarch, but neither did they chase her off. That was new. There was a tension in the group, not open rejection, not acceptance, a holding pattern. For 2 days, Zara remained on the outer edge of the pride, never joining meals, but never being forced away either. The cub, whom Elias had begun referring to as Ash in his notes, stayed nestled beside her at all times. He didn't explore, he didn't play, but he watched, always watching. It was on the third day that something shifted. Elias was cleaning his camera lens when he caught it, movement subtle but unmistakable. One of the other lionesses, Nara, the one who had lost her own cubs 2 seasons ago, approached Zara's resting spot under a low, twisted tree. Slowly, without threat. Her head was low, tail relaxed. She circled once and then lay down a few feet away. Zara didn't move. She just blinked, her ribs showing with every breath. Then Ash did something unexpected. He stood up. Not confidently, not boldly, but he stood, tottered toward Nara, and collapsed against her flank. The older lioness didn't flinch. She simply lowered her head and began to groom him. Elias froze. It was the first true contact from any member of the pride. And it wasn't just tolerance, it was care. He noted it, circled it, dated it. In conservation research, there's a term used sparingly: behavioral anomaly. It refers to actions that diverge from established patterns, moments when animals make decisions that contradict what science predicts. But Elias didn't use that term here. This wasn't anomaly. This was evolution. That evening, something else changed. Zara, for the first time since the birth, was allowed to feed with the group. The kill was small, an impala taken down near a dried-up riverbed, but the gesture was large. No one snarled. No one lunged. The matriarch stood watch but made no move to interfere. Ash didn't eat. He still hadn't learned the patterns of tearing meat or competing for space. But he lay near the carcass, watching with those pale eyes that now looked almost golden in the light of dusk. Nara stayed close, licking his ears occasionally. His body pressed against hers like a second shadow. Elias watched from his ridge, camera forgotten beside him. He wasn't sure when he'd last seen something like this. The cub wasn't thriving yet. He was still underweight, still vulnerable. But he was no longer alone. The story was rewriting itself in real time. What had begun as a simple observation of rejection had transformed into something else, something with meaning. Later that night, Elias uploaded footage to his secure drive and began drafting a report. He labeled it Phase 2, Integration Indicators. But the title felt hollow. This wasn't just data anymore. This was a living case study in adaptive social behavior, the kind of moment that could challenge long-standing theories about survival instincts and group dynamics. It could even reshape how organizations approached wildlife rehabilitation. He made a note to include terms like adaptive kinship behavior and non-genetic caregiving in his formal summary. Not for the science, but for the funders. Search engine optimization mattered now, even in conservation. Terms like wildlife rescue, animal rehabilitation, and natural healing after trauma weren't just academic. They brought visibility, and visibility brought funding. But beneath the notes, Elias knew this was simpler than jargon. It was just love. Misplaced, perhaps. Unusual, certainly, but unmistakable. The next morning, the real proof arrived. The pride moved again, toward a dried-out pan where a faint water source remained. The journey was longer than usual and harder. The cubs had grown restless. The older males were irritable. The air held no promise of rain, but as the pride moved, so did Ash. He was positioned between Zara and Nara now. The 2 lionesses flanked him naturally, creating a soft V around his smaller frame. When he lagged, they paused. When he stumbled, they nudged. The matriarch watched, but said nothing. No growl, no protest. And then the dominant male did something no one expected. He stepped aside. In every move until now, the male had claimed the center position, at the head of the pride or embedded within. But this time he shifted left, creating a natural corridor. Zara stepped through first. Then Ash. Then Nara. No one challenged it. Elias stared, stunned. It was more than acceptance. It was a reordering. The pride wasn't just tolerating the cub, they were adjusting for him. They were learning to carry his pace, his weakness, his strange white presence, and making room for it. He documented every moment, every glance, every subtle shift. That night, while reviewing the footage, he paused on a still frame. Ash walking between the two lionesses, framed by dust and sunlight. The image was imperfect, a little out of focus, but it held something rare. Motion, story, truth. He exported it and labeled it Turning Point. He didn't sleep much that night. His thoughts circled back to his earliest days in the field, when he still believed that animals were governed by instinct alone. He thought of the cheetah he had tried to save and the cost that followed. He thought of how many times he had said, "Nature knows best," and meant it with certainty. But now, watching a pride of lions adapt to a cub they should have abandoned, he realized he'd only understood half the story. Nature didn't just know best. Sometimes it learned. Ash was walking differently now. The rhythm of his steps had changed, no longer the cautious, stuttering crawl of a creature hoping not to be noticed, but a slow and deliberate gait, echoing the ones he had grown up watching. He still lagged behind the older cubs. He still blinked too often in the light, and his ears twitched at sudden noises. But he walked without hugging the edges anymore. He walked in the open. The pride had begun its slow migration eastward, toward a ridge that Elias knew marked the start of a long, dry season. The water pans were shrinking. Prey was scattered. Travel was necessary, but dangerous. The elders led the way, their shoulders heavy with history, and in the center of the line, tucked between Zara and Nara, padded the pale figure that days ago had no place to exist. Ash didn't look back. Elias followed from a respectful distance, driving his weather-worn truck across hard-pan dirt, the tires humming over cracks and brittle stone. He paused occasionally to capture footage, adjusting his camera settings with muscle memory. But most of the time, he just watched. It was hard not to be emotional. He had seen animals survive before. He had seen them adapt. But this was the slow, living miracle of social evolution. A recalibration not written into genes, but into behavior, into decision, into something like grace. Late in the afternoon, the pride reached a rise in the land and settled. The wind carried the scent of distant herds, gemsbok, maybe kudu. The male scanned the horizon, his muscles twitching beneath his skin. It was a hunting day. The lionesses began their slow descent toward the valley floor, all except Zara, Nara, and the matriarch. They stayed behind, with Ash. Elias took note of it. It wasn't just that they left a protector. It was that the protector was now chosen by rotation, as if they had created a system, a structure around him, a new normal. Ash, for his part, didn't play during the wait. He watched. He had grown quiet again, not from fear this time, but from awareness. When the matriarch stretched beside him, he pressed into her side without hesitation. She closed her eyes, accepting. The hunt failed that night. Elias knew before they returned. The smell of blood never arrived on the wind. The lionesses came back dusty and empty-bellied, but there was no visible frustration, no aggression. They lay down in silence, surrounding their cubs. And then, quietly, something even stranger happened. The dominant male, aloof, powerful, generally disinterested in cubs, walked over to where Ash was curled beside Zara. He didn't approach fast. He didn't tower. He simply lay down nearby, close enough to count as contact, but far enough to allow choice. Ash didn't move at first. He looked, waited. Then he stood, crossed the narrow space, and nestled near the male's chest. No one growled. No one flinched. And just like that, The last unspoken line had been erased. The white cub was no longer fringe. He was pride. That evening, Elias didn't film. He sat outside his tent with a cup of bitter tea, the stars sharp overhead. His laptop hummed quietly beside him, open to a draft report labeled Behavioral Study, Non-Genetic Integration in Panthera leo. But he wasn't typing. Instead, he replayed a different kind of conversation in his head, the kind that might come next. Emails from NGOs, requests from international wildlife foundations, possible interviews with National Geographic or even high-traffic media pages that covered miracle animal stories. He knew what they'd ask. What can we do with this? How can this help? Where do we take the cub? And that's when it came. The message. It arrived quietly, a soft chime from his satellite phone. It was from Dr. Lilian Mercado, the East Africa liaison for the World Wildlife Genetics Program. Elias had worked with her once, years ago. They had shared field space in Uganda for a month and a cautious professional respect. The message read, "Elias, we've received word of a potential albino cub in the Kgalagadi region. Very rare genetics. Possibly one of only a handful alive today. Would love to collaborate. If you can confirm, we'd like to initiate low-impact extraction for conservation. Could mean a future breeding program. Let's talk." Lilian Elias stared at the words for a long time. He knew what it meant. Funding, research, publications, protected enclosures, genetic preservation. A future. And yet. He glanced down at the plain below, where the pride was resting. Ash lay curled against Zara's ribs, his body rising and falling in sync with hers. Nara had one paw draped across both of them, half asleep but present. The male was near the edge, eyes open, still watching. This wasn't a program. This was a family. Elias closed the message without replying. Not yet. He returned to his journal and wrote, "The crown is not gold. It is dust. It is not claimed by dominance, but earned in the quiet act of belonging. He was never meant to rule, only to be allowed. And somehow that is more." As he put his pen down, the wind shifted again. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a promise. Ash was walking differently now. The rhythm of his steps had changed, no longer the cautious, stuttering crawl of a creature hoping not to be noticed, but a slow and deliberate gait, echoing the ones he had grown up watching. He still lagged behind the older cubs. He still blinked too often in the light, and his ears twitched at sudden noises. But he walked without hugging the edges anymore. He walked in the open. The pride had begun its slow migration eastward, toward a ridge that Elias knew marked the start of a long, dry season. The water pans were shrinking. Prey was scattered. Travel was necessary, but dangerous. The elders led the way, their shoulders heavy with history, and in the center of the line, tucked between Zara and Nara, padded the pale figure that days ago had no place to exist. Ash didn't look back. Elias followed from a respectful distance, driving his weather-worn truck across hard-pan dirt, the tires humming over cracks and brittle stone. He paused occasionally to capture footage, adjusting his camera settings with muscle memory. But most of the time, he just watched. It was hard not to be emotional. He had seen animals survive before. He had seen them adapt. But this was the slow, living miracle of social evolution. A recalibration not written into genes, but into behavior, into decision, into something like grace. Late in the afternoon, the pride reached a rise in the land and settled. The wind carried the scent of distant herds, gemsbok, maybe kudu. The male scanned the horizon, his muscles twitching beneath his skin. It was a hunting day. The lionesses began their slow descent toward the valley floor, all except Zara, Nara, and the matriarch. They stayed behind, with Ash. Elias took note of it. It wasn't just that they left a protector. It was that the protector was now chosen by rotation. as if they had created a system, a structure around him, a new normal. Ash, for his part, didn't play during the wait. He watched. He had grown quiet again, not from fear this time, but from awareness. When the matriarch stretched beside him, he pressed into her side without hesitation. She closed her eyes, accepting. The hunt failed that night. Elias knew before they returned. The smell of blood never arrived on the wind. The lionesses came back dusty and empty-bellied, but there was no visible frustration, no aggression. They lay down in silence, surrounding their cubs. And then, quietly, something even stranger happened. The dominant male, aloof, powerful, generally disinterested in cubs, walked over to where Ash was curled beside Zara. He didn't approach fast. He didn't tower. He simply lay down nearby, close enough to count as contact, but far enough to allow choice. Ash didn't move at first. He looked, waited. Then he stood, crossed the narrow space, and nestled near the male's chest. No one growled. No one flinched. And just like that, the last unspoken line had been erased. The white cub was no longer fringe. He was pride. That evening, Elias didn't film. He sat outside his tent with a cup of bitter tea, the stars sharp overhead. His laptop hummed quietly beside him, open to a draft report labeled Behavioral Study, Non-Genetic Integration in Panthera leo. But he wasn't typing. Instead, he replayed a different kind of conversation in his head, the kind that might come next. Emails from NGOs, requests from international wildlife foundations, possible interviews with National Geographic or even high-traffic media pages that covered miracle animal stories. He knew what they'd ask. What can we do with this? How can this help? Where do we take the cub? And that's when it came. The message. It arrived quietly, a soft chime from his satellite phone. It was from Dr. Lillian Mercado, the East Africa liaison for the World Wildlife Genetics Program. Elias had worked with her once, years ago. They had shared field space in Uganda for a month and a cautious professional respect. The message read, Elias, we've received word of a potential albino cub in the Kgalagadi region. Very rare genetics. Possibly one of only a handful alive today. Would love to collaborate. If you can confirm, we'd like to initiate low-impact extraction for conservation. Could mean a future breeding program. Let's talk. Lillian Elias stared at the words for a long time. He knew what it meant. Funding, research, publications, protected enclosures, genetic preservation. A future. And yet. He glanced down at the plain below, where the pride was resting. Ash lay curled against Zara's ribs, his body rising and falling in sync with hers. Nara had one paw draped across both of them, half asleep but present. The male was near the edge, eyes open, still watching. This wasn't a program. This was a family. Elias closed the message without replying. Not yet. He returned to his journal and wrote, The crown is not gold. It is dust. It is not claimed by dominance, but earned in the quiet act of belonging. He was never meant to rule, only to be allowed. And somehow that is more. As he put his pen down, the wind shifted again. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a promise. The final morning came quietly. There were no roaring winds, no smoke, no warning signs in the air. Just the familiar rustle of dry grass and the deep silence that only deserts understand. Elias stood outside his canvas tent, hands wrapped around a tin mug of black coffee gone cold. The pride had begun to stir at the base of the ridge, distant but visible in the first blush of dawn. The light hit them in fragments, one lioness at a time, a ripple of gold across the sand. His departure was overdue. The permit had already lapsed by 3 days. Supplies were running low. A park officer from Trois-Rivières was expected at his location within hours to escort him back to the station for checkout and debrief. Protocol. Always protocol. But what Elias couldn't shake What sat heavy in his chest was that he didn't want to leave. Not this, not now. The Pride was different. They no longer walked in the same formation. They moved slower, tighter. They looked for each other more often, shared space more easily. Ash had become a small, steady constant, not dominant, not central in strength, but central in meaning. He walked in the middle now, not flanked like something fragile, but with them, part of them. And it was visible. Anyone watching could see it. That was the danger. He'd received 2 more emails since Lillian's first message, one from a conservation genetics agency in South Africa, asking for hair samples if possible. Another from a popular streaming platform inquiring about exclusive documentary rights. Keywords like wildlife funding, rare species protection, and genetic legacy were threaded throughout, all of them well-meaning, all of them eager to help. But none of them understood. They wanted data. Elias had found a story. As he packed his gear, he took extra care with one item, a large, heavy-duty memory card locked in a fireproof case. It held hundreds of hours of footage. The birth, the rejection, Zara's choice, the fire, the fight, the circle, and one last clip, recorded just the evening before. Ash, now nearly the size of the other cubs, had been rolling in the dirt near the edge of camp when one of the adolescent males, a half-brother, approached. Not to threaten, to play. The 2 had pounced and rolled and tumbled in the dust, claws sheathed, tails high. It was clumsy and short, but real. Zara had watched with a kind of stillness that meant everything. Not pride, not possessiveness, just stillness. Like her work was done. Elias snapped a still frame of it. Ash upside down, paws in the air, mouth open in a half-growl that looked more like a laugh. The other cub leaping sideways, blurry in motion. Behind them, the faint outline of the Pride gathered loosely under a dying tree. Content. That was the image. The one that would stay. He tucked the case into his rucksack and zipped it closed. Then he took out his field log, the one he'd used every day since arriving, and turned to the last page. He didn't write a summary. He didn't list observations or recommend policy updates. He wrote a sentence. Sometimes the miracle isn't that something survives. It's that others change to make survival possible. He left the page blank after that. When the ranger truck arrived, a man in uniform climbed out and greeted Elias with a firm handshake. There was no rush. They moved slowly, respectfully, as people do in the presence of something sacred. The last thing Elias did before stepping into the vehicle was walk to the top of the ridge. One final look. Below, the Pride had begun to move again. Ash walked near the front this time. Not leading, but not lagging either. He glanced backward once, just a flick of his head, as if sensing something unseen. And then he kept going. Hours later, in a roadside lodge with shaky Wi-Fi and no air conditioning, Elias opened his laptop to review the last clips before backup. His inbox was full again, press, researchers, invitations to speak at wildlife summits. One message stood out. From Lillian again. Any update on the albino lion? Still interested in coordinating extraction if the Pride dynamics allow. Would be an incredible genetic asset. Also, congrats! Your footage made it into our top conservation proposals for next quarter. You've made a real impact here. Elias read it twice. He thought about what he'd seen, what the world wanted to use, and what he'd chosen to witness. He hit reply, paused, and typed. The lion is not an asset. He is a member of a family that built itself around him, not because of what he could pass on, but because of what he survived. I will not disrupt that. I suggest we all learn from it instead. He clicked send. And then, as the sun dipped once more over the dry horizon, Elias uploaded a single image to the secure wildlife archives. A wide-angle shot of the pride walking through the sand, dust rising behind them like a crown. In the center, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was ash. White against red earth. Still walking, still claimed, still home.